good night, or good evening, I should say. I'm not wishing you good night yet. I don't think you'll go to sleep. I hope you don't. I might have a tendency to if I was out there. But thank you for letting me be here and be a part of this special event. The reason I was messing with my phone right before I got up because I'm looking for a clock, but I don't see a clock. Maybe that's true, but when I'm told, hey, you can just go till 7:30, I can turn 7:30 into like 7:35, 7:40. I preached at a church for many years over in Knoxville, Tennessee, and there's a guy who used to lead prayer, but he was also the one from whom I had a collection of letters about the length of my sermon. He was one of these who believed that the optimal sermon was 19 to 20 minutes long. And anything over that, he would give you a few seconds here or there, but anything over that 20-minute mark, he would always come at it. So I had this little collection of letters from him, and we had some dialogue going, all right? So one time before I stood up to preach, he said, and Lord, he was leading the prayer. He said, Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity we have to come and sing your praises and to enjoy fellowship with one another and to hear a lesson from your word until 11:30 or 11:35 or 11:40 or so. So, all right, Joe, I'm getting the point. But anyway, I've got my little timer set, so I hope I observe this, but I'm going to ask you something. Yeah, give me that if you would. I tell you what, with me, you need to do this. Okay, then a 5. All right, good. All right. First time to be in Russellville, Arkansas, except for one other time, many years ago, when I was traveling through and went to some restaurant that I can't even remember the name of. So I don't feel like a homeboy yet. But I grew up in West Kentucky, a little town called Mayfield. Actually, it's pronounced Mayfield. For those of you from over there, it's just south of Paducah. Ain't far from the Mississippi River and the Tennessee River. It's just sort of right smack there in the middle of western Kentucky. And I was born in 1959. I know for you guys that really makes me seem ancient, okay? But born in 1959, which means I'm a boomer, right? I'm a baby boomer. I'm of that generation. And when I was growing up as a teenager, and on Friday nights we'd cruise the Strip, Is this making sense? Some of you are shaking your head like you know exactly what. Well, here's what cruising the Strip means. A little lesson of history. Back during that time, gas was cheap, all right? And so you got in your daddy's Pontiac Catalina on Friday night, and you started at one end of town and circled the Dairy Queen parking lot, all right? And then you went 5 minutes to the north side of town and circled the Plaza parking lot. And you did that about 35 or 40 times in one Friday night. And occasionally, you'd stop at the parking lot and you'd let up the trunk of your car and get out the great big speakers. That's back when you had 8-track sound systems, okay? You'd let out the great big speakers and everybody would fire up, Grand Funk Railroad or something like that, Well, there was a singer during that time who he was kind of a protest artist. And what I mean by a protest artist is that whatever current was happening where he felt the need from a social perspective to protest the establishment, he would do it. Now, there were a lot of singers during that time that did, all right? But this is one. Some of you will recognize the song even if you weren't during that time. Come gather round people wherever you roam and admit that the waters around you have grown and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen and keep your eyes wide. The chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will later to win, for the times they are a-changing. Come, senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway. Don't block up the hall. For he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changing. Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you don't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing. The line is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast. As the present now will later be past, the order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, for the times they are a-changing. Some of you sang it while I read it. I heard you. I saw you. You were doing this. All right. Now, my memories of that song are not only from Bob Dylan singing it, but from my preacher denouncing it from the pulpit. Now, that brought a chuckle. I mean, some of you remember that more than anything. You know, it's kind of like the same ilk. You know, if you play some of the Beatles songs backwards, you know, you get this, you know. Okay, all right. Wasn't quite like that. But it's understandable, right, to some extent, why the churches were a little uncomfortable with this song from Bob Dylan. Because who is it that he was coming out against, right? The establishment. Quote, the establishment during that time. And churches, of course, were a part of the establishment. And what he was saying essentially is this. There is this tide rolling in the culture. You either get with it or get out of the way, because the times, they are a-changing, right? Part of the social prophecy of the time. Well, and we rightly felt uncomfortable with a lot of it. But I wonder what Bob Dylan would sing today if he were writing a similar song. We are living in a pretty turbulent time. And I look through the lyrics of this song by Dylan and I think, some of it just makes me wince, but there's a part of it that makes me realize that there is a watching world out there who sees reality very differently than we see it. And to them, for many of us, it just seems like we should just sort of stop and get out of the way. We're irrelevant. We're meaningless to what's really happening in the world. There is a demographer named George Barna who has done some interesting research about the way Christians are perceived in our day and time. And it's tucked into a book called Good Faith. I want you to listen to what he says. And this is going to rattle your cage, all right? So hold on. You holding on to your cage? All right. Hold on to your cage, because this is going to rattle it a little bit. Now, we're going somewhere in 1 Peter. If you want to turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, you can go ahead and do that. Because I'm trying to help us see how important this text is for us today. Here's what he said. This is Barna in his research. People of every religious tradition, and secularists too, make claims about the nature of reality and how humans ought to live within it. Most people believe their own religions or non-religions' appraisal of reality is true, and not just true for me, but true for human beings everywhere. He says, 8 out of 10 practicing Christians agree that the Bible contains moral truths that are true for all people without exception. We would affirm that, right? Yeah. Now, he says, this bothers some people. They believe religion should be consigned to the realm of the private, to the family home, or to the house of worship. No exceptions. They claim real life happens in laboratories, in the marketplace, in boardrooms, and city halls. They're convinced that spirituality and other fluffy, intangible stuff matter only peripherally, to real life, and their views are gaining currency in the culture. Listen to some of these statistics. More than 2 out of 5 Americans believe that when it comes to what happens in the country today, people of faith and religion are part of the problem. Did you get that? 2 out of 5 people in the United States believe that religious people are part of the problem in the culture. They reject the idea that religion can be a part of the solution. He continues. The public's perception of the clergy has changed. 50 years ago, clergy members, I'm using their language, were commonly viewed as the most important leaders of our society. They were trusted sources of wisdom across a wide spectrum of issues. But the public's respect for, in their language again, pastors, priests, and other faith leaders has significantly declined. Listen to this. Today, only 1/5 of U.S. adults strongly believe that clergy are a credible source of wisdom and insight when it comes to the most important issues of the day. 1/5. Now that shift has occurred pretty quickly. I started preaching full time when I was in my 20s. And I remember during that time, and really for about the first 15 years or so of my ministry, there was still this sense that if you were a minister, there was a kind of respect that people had toward you. I even called it sometimes the third gender principle. You know, I'd be standing at an elevator at the hospital with my little pin on that allowed me to go into ICU. You know, you always had to go to the chaplain's office and get a little pin that you would wear throughout the hospital, and so that you could go in and out of the rooms and that sort of thing. And I'd be wearing that. And I would press the button on the elevator, and then the elevator door would open, and there was a big group of people in there, and you could tell that before I walked in, everybody had been carrying on conversation. I mean, you just got that sense. You could actually hear the rumble. But as soon as I stepped in, all the conversation stopped. And people actually apologized for some of the things they had said before I got in that I didn't even hear. Okay? It's like neither male nor female has stepped in here. There's a minister has walked in. You know, it's not a real human being. It's a minister. You know, kind of a religious robot. You know, there was this sense that when we walked into a room, things changed, got a little different, and people would, you know, sort of stumble all over themselves and apologize for their language or for their manner or something. I'm not saying I necessarily liked all that. You know, I kind of liked the discounts at the clothing stores, but, you know, it wasn't that so much that I liked it. It was just the reality. Today, it's very, very different. Have you talked to most ministers about how that when they get on an airplane, and they sit down and talk with folks and they're getting to know them, and the question comes up, well, what do you do? All right, we got ministers here in the room, all right? When people ask you, what do you do? What's your natural tendency? It's to try to want to find some other way of describing what you do. Well, I work for a, nonprofit agency of several hundred people, and we do everything we can to, circulate in the community and do a lot of good. And I serve in kind of a teaching and administrative role with that group. Oh, you're a preacher? Yeah. Well, yeah, right. Okay. Because there's a stigma attached to what we represent. Of course, there's also been a lot of ministerial failure, okay, moral failure. I get that. And we do have a credibility issue there. But there's this sense that what we represent is now viewed as a significant part of the problem. I'm not saying it's right or good. I'm just saying this is the way we tend to be viewed. Others consider how attitudes have changed when it comes to public expressions of religious commitment, they continue. As Western culture continues to become more secular, many of the everyday acts of devotion practiced by people of faith, whether Christians or Jews or Muslims and many others, are increasingly considered inappropriate by an ever wider swath of the growing non-religious population. In other words, this is one of their conclusions, which I think is interesting. More people are skeptical of hard lines and strong convictions, preferring a watered-down tolerance over a hard-won peace. A new generation is reflexively suspicious of anything that smacks of religious devotion. For these folks, a life lived with religious conviction is not just countercultural or counterintuitive, but dangerous, even damaging. In their view, if you raise your children to embrace the same convictions, you are beyond extreme. You may even be criminal. And this represents, according to their research, about 40% of the American population. And that probably depends on certain population areas. It would not be as high perhaps in Russellville, Arkansas as it would be in Seattle, Washington. But it's strong. Now, they continued in their research, and the research was broad. Here's what they said. Barna Group interviewed thousands of U.S. adults and more than 1,000 faith leaders, including Protestant ministers and Catholic ministers, and as well as Jewish, Muslim, Mormon, and other clergy. The goal was to get an accurate lay of the cultural landscape, particularly of the places where communities of faith feel friction with their surrounding culture. And here were two perceptions about Christians that they ran into repeatedly. These are the two main perceptions about Christians that they ran into repeatedly. Here it is. Christians are viewed as irrelevant and extreme. Irrelevant and extreme. Here's what they mean by irrelevance. Irrelevance is primarily about the rising tide of apathy toward religion overall and Christianity specifically. In one of their previous books, they talked about the hostility of the younger non-Christians toward Christianity, which is true, and admitted that there was some truth to their perceptions. But an even more significant challenge may be that growing numbers of adults, and especially younger adults, have no inkling that Christianity matters and could matter to them. Furthermore, they have little appreciation for how Christians generate good in the world. We're viewed as irrelevant. We just don't matter. We don't get the things done that need to get done. And here's part of it, and this is part of what they discussed, is that folks in the larger community will sometimes read or hear or listen to what we debate and argue about in church among ourselves. And I don't want to mention any of the issues, okay, because I'm afraid if I mention an issue, you guys may be discussing it. Okay, that's one of the, there's some advantages to being the guy with the briefcase from out of town. That's one of the disadvantages of being the guy with the briefcase from out of town. I don't know what you've been discussing among yourselves. But sometimes folks in the outlying world will listen to that and say, you guys argue about that? Really? Really? And it contributes to this whole notion of irrelevance. Secondly, the perception that we are extreme is the second major obstacle for Christians today. Many very bad things are legitimately called extremism and should be prevented, yes. Yet some religious beliefs and practices are considered extremist not because they're violent, but because they're different. They're just different. And so we're extreme. We're extreme. You say, well, how does this relate to 1 Peter chapter 2? 1 Peter was written to a group of people who were dealing with much of the same environment. At a more significant level even than that. There's tucked into this text in 1 Peter, things like 1 Peter chapter 4, when he's talking to them about morality. And he says, like in verse 3 of 1 Peter 4, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans do, living in debauchery and lust and drunkenness and orgies and carousing and detestable idolatry. They think it's strange that you do not plunge with them into the same flood of dissipation, and they heap abuse on you. They were dealing with people who simply didn't understand. Why do you have all these scruples? Why does this matter to you like this? And they couldn't understand why these people disavowed their previous lifestyle and became what in their book seemed irreligious by affirming only one God and not all the gods. And that was just one of many, many things that these early Christians dealt with. And Peter's writing to a group of people who are heavily marginalized. I mean, there's not enough, people didn't respect them. They didn't look up to them. They thought they were irrelevant and maybe a little extreme. Why don't you do this anymore? What I find really interesting is that where Peter raises his voice in this book, and you can tell by some of the language that he uses when Peter gets to a spot where he's raising his voice and putting the exclamation point, the bold print, and that sort of thing. When he really, really raises his voice, and in a sense says, if you don't get anything else that I'm saying to you, get this. One of those occurrences in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. We might even say that, this is a bit of an overstatement, but there's some truth to it, that everything up to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 was sort of intended to lead up to it. And then everything after 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12 sort of leads out of it. Not entirely, but it's pretty close. It's a really important, pivotal text. And this is Peter's advice to Christians who are viewed as irrelevant and extreme to the culture at large. This is what he says. Verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world. Stop there for just a moment. There's some discussion among scholars as to what aliens and strangers means there. Is it descriptive or prescriptive? You know, is it Peter saying, okay, it's good that you're aliens and strangers? Or is it his way of saying, that's the way you're regarded as sort of aliens and strangers in the world? I think it's kind of both, but I lean toward the descriptive. You know, that Peter is saying, you guys are, you know, you're viewed as somewhat alien and strange. People look at you and they think you're just weird for believing what you believe, for doing what you do, for refusing to do what you refuse to do. There's nothing in the text, I think, that encourages us to set out to be odd for God. You know, where we just do things in the name of God to be different. I don't think that's what the text is saying. It says, you're in a place where, yes, you've been given a God-given identity. You have that. You are, verses 9 and 10, just before this, you are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. You're a people belonging to God. And you have good reason to identify with this incredible privilege that God has given you to share his praises and to speak his word. You are that. But in terms of the way the world sees you, you're aliens and strangers. So he says, I urge you, that's that oomph language, as aliens and strangers in the world, to do two things, and here they are. Number one, to abstain from sinful desires that war against your soul. And number two, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Let's read the text again. This is Peter's main exhortation in the book. And this is the way he says it again, verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires that war against your soul. And number two, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. It's a call to radical goodness. It is that. To radical goodness. I want you to notice that it is not a call to sameness. It's not that. You see, I think innately most of us understand, even if we don't acknowledge it in the words that I've used to describe it tonight. I think most of us understand that the world just doesn't understand us. We get that, right? We get that. And so when we're thinking about something like making our worship assemblies, something that people from the outside can come in and take part in, we're always trying to think about how to change things in such a way that we make sense to people who do not have our heritage, our pedigree, right? And so we do all kinds of things that are intended to remove barriers. And removing barriers is a good thing. Certainly, we don't need to put up barriers. And the last thing that we would encourage is doing that. But I think sometimes what happens when we feel this distance between us and the world, we sometimes want to do what we can to emphasize the likeness we have with people who are not Christians. Repeatedly in the New Testament. Repeatedly in the New Testament. The call for Christians is not, however, to emphasize their sameness, but to demonstrate Christ's goodness. That's the essential call. And if you want to go back and forth in the New Testament and find the way that the New Testament writers want Christians to demonstrate themselves to the world, there's a recurring emphasis on holiness. Holiness. And holiness is not an emphasis on sameness. Holiness is an emphasis on our reflecting the character and the goodness and the life of God himself and projecting that onto our relationships, onto our work, and everything else that we do. And this is Peter's way of saying the same thing. Number one, abstain from the sinful desires that war against your soul. And number two, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Again, a call to radical goodness. Several years ago, I read through an interesting book by Michael Green on evangelism in the early church. And one of the things he talked about over and over in that book is that the evangelistic strategy of the Christians during this time was very different than anything you and I could really think about doing. Listen to the way he describes it. He says, given the context of Peter's recipients, we have to ask how Christianity was actually able to spread. They were not able to use market-driven approaches in their hostile environment. He says contemporary methods of evangelism often begin with holy accommodations to appeal to the felt needs of potential converts or with some other direct presentation to audiences that, if not receptive, are largely polite and tolerant. But these early Christians had assumed their unique moral identity to the extent that the surrounding culture ridiculed them, slandered them, and sought to intimidate them. A little bit similar to what we're experiencing today. Their responsibility to evangelize was no less than ours, but it took place under conditions that were radically more difficult than ours. How did Christianity spread under such unfavorable circumstances? Certainly early Christian assemblies had an impact on outsiders, perhaps partially explaining how Peter's recipients had heard the gospel. But the impact of individual Christians sharing their faith in the home and the marketplace was also strong. But Peter strikes at something that is even more foundational in the early church's evangelistic effectiveness, the distinctiveness of their lifestyle in contrast to the pagan society. That was what did it. And that was what was so incredibly winsome. The surrounding culture consisted of people who were slaves to their passions, but Christians had rejected that part of their past. They now submitted their passions to God, and the effect of this was evangelistic. Outsiders took notice of the difference, and it worked. it worked. Now, but here's what we know. We know this is important, but here's what we know. There's also research to demonstrate that when it comes right down to any kind of consistent difference in the lifestyles of people who are, quote, conservative evangelical Christians and those who are not, there is an almost imperceptible difference on a number of scales. An almost imperceptible difference. Let me give you one example of this. Worldwide, do you know the religious group? Now, this is going to surprise you. Do you know the religious persuasion that is more likely to be abusive to their wives? I'm talking about all forms of abusiveness, okay? Verbal abusiveness, physical abusiveness, emotional abuse, and that sort of thing. Those who are more likely to be abusive to their wives, I don't want you to guess it out loud. You know what they're finding? That of all the religious groups, I'm talking about religious groups that claim to be Christian. Okay, let's stop there, all right? Religious groups that claim to be Christian. It's people of conservative evangelical convictions. More men in that category will tend to be abusive of their wives and even use religion as a way of trying to enforce themselves on their wives. I think that's part of the reason why Peter says what he does over here in 1 Peter chapter 7. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life so that nothing will hinder your prayers. I mean, Peter's encouraging a completely countercultural perspective over against the way a man of that time would have a tendency to see a woman, his wife, who had chosen perhaps a different religious conviction or religious track in her life than what the man of the house would have chosen. During that time, the pater familias was so strong, and if you adopted a religion that was different than that of the head of the household, there were a lot of prices to pay, and it was very, very difficult. And Peter is underscoring here how important it is for the husbands particularly, and the wives, but the husbands and wives to be able to make a kind of testimony about the beauty and the grace that is to come upon people who follow Jesus and the way they treat each other. But that's just one illustration of the many that I could give you where it's like this. Part of the reason why we lose so much ground among people we are trying to reach is that they look at the way we live and they say, I don't see much of a difference that Christianity has made in you. This is the way one missionary in India experienced it. A little bit different, but the story still rings true. Missionary in India went from village to village, and he was doing his best to get people to listen to his message about Christ, and he did everything he could to get their attention. And once when he spoke of Christ, there's an elderly man, a Hindu, who spoke up and said these very words, "Dear preacher, we have listened with interest, yes, with respect to your words about Jesus Christ. We love Christ and we honor him as the unique man and as God. We also like to read your Bible when we have the time and are not too tired. But pardon me for saying this. This does not make us want to become Christians. Don't we know your parishioners? Don't we know how they live? How much hostility and enmity, how much drunkenness and deceit there is among them? they live no better than we do. And so the emphasis that Peter gives, abstain from the sinful desires that war against your soul, and live such good lives among the pagans, that though they may accuse you of wrong, they will glorify God. Several years ago, I read from a man who at the time when I was going through my schooling at Lipscomb back in the 80s, a fellow named Francis Schaeffer. Schaeffer was especially concerned about how Christian faith defended itself in the public arena. And he wrote a little tract entitled The Mark of the Christian. And it was based on John 13:34 and 35. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. And how important it was for that to occur. And this is what he said. He's talking about apologetics, right? The defense of the Christian faith. And he said, beauty in human relationships is the chief apologetic. Nothing is more powerful than that. What are some implications of this? Some implications of this. Think first about every encounter that you have on a day-to-day basis. And ask yourself whether you have an image-based way of living your life, or whether at the core there is a kind of goodness that manifests itself apart from the circumstances that you are in. Think about yourself waiting in a long line, backed up several tens of feet, 50 feet or more, and you're waiting in line in customer service, and you're there with a bunch of other people. Is your behavior any different than anyone else's there? When you get up to that counter and that person is finally waiting on you, do you use that as an opportunity to speak a gracious word to that person, perhaps even relieving some of their angst, and perhaps even giving them the kinder word than they've had all day long? When you are calling Comcast customer service, and you have waited and waited and waited after having been put on hold for who knows how long, listening to very pleasant music that was designed to entertain you during the wait, that your approximate wait time is 10 minutes. You are fourth in the queue. And then this little 19-year-old girl who has her summer job in customer service answers the phone. Thank you for calling Comcast. How may I help you? Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of wrong, they may see your good deeds. Or let's think about it along these lines. It's beyond that. You remember I talked about the image, living image-based. Living image-based means that when I know I'm being watched, when I know there's the potential of my being watched, I ramp it up, right? But when I don't think I'm being watched, then the real me comes out. If I understand Jesus correctly when he says it's out of the heart that the mouth speaks, you remember that statement? I really think what he means there is that the mouth says what just sort of overflows from here, okay? And character is revealed especially in the unrehearsed moments, when we don't have time to think about what we're going to say and just what we are spills out, right? When we don't have time to think about how we're going to behave, and whatever behavior is going to manifest itself does, like when you're in traffic. and somebody pulls in front of you when they shouldn't, and you're tempted to just lay on the horn, only hoping that it's not some person going to the same church you are that morning that you haven't met yet. Okay, now that's one thing, all right? But on the other hand, what if the people who know you best in whatever circle of life were to describe you? What words would they use? Patrick Morley wrote a book many years ago that was quite good called The Man in the Mirror. And in one point in the book, he says, a major turning point occurred in my life when I began to think about who was going to be attending my funeral and what reason they would have to either celebrate or mourn my passing. You know, I think there's some wisdom in that, right? The Ecclesiastes writer points to it. Better to go into the house of mourning than into the house of feasting. It's better to contemplate your death sometimes than to think about the life that's in front of you, because sometimes it can be very, very sobering. But the point that Morley was making is this, that whatever way you're wanting to be remembered, that you hope you will be remembered, you need to actually be investing your life now in those day-to-day activities that are actually going to contribute to that perception once you get there. And there's also this sense that whatever contribution you make in those day-to-day activities and those small things that you do from time to time will either contribute to an older life of joy or an older life full of regrets. But how would they know you? How would they describe you? What would be their experience with you? When they have encounters with you, do they walk away feeling enriched, feeling like their lives have been blessed, or feeling like something has taken life out of them? Those are just a few of many, many tests that we could ask ourselves to see just how much of this has sunk in. I'll close with this. For many years in America, we believed that we could be effective with our Christian mission by simply doing the best teaching and the best defense of our beliefs over against alternative forms of belief. And as long as we articulated our beliefs and articulated our perspectives well, then we gained ground. We're living in a time now that the more articulate you are with your beliefs and your perspectives, then the more ground you actually lose. You actually lose ground by heavy articulation. We're living in a time that people are not listening so much to what we say and what we teach. That comes, but it's not first. What they're looking for is how we live. It's the emphasis on what is called, sometimes referred to as orthopraxy over orthodoxy. Because the people in our surrounding culture are saying to us loudly, and the statistics reveal it, you don't live your claims. And Peter is saying that has to change. Radical goodness. Radical goodness. And it gets down to morality, and it just gets down to basically the kinds of ways that we try to impact our communities and the good that we seek to do. Lisa Joe encourages moms through her blogging and writing in Virginia. Jim talks about Jesus in natural and unforced ways with his house painting customers in Seattle. Mission Year provides students with an opportunity to serve together for 1 year for the benefit of a city neighborhood and then incorporate what they learn into their future life. Jeff teaches high school students in Denver to love C.S. Lewis. Ruth brings her faith to work styling clients' hair in Edinburgh, Scotland. Simon and Marianne adopted 2 kids with learning and behavioral difficulties near London. Terrian helps teenagers create art and learn design. Lori lives and works among Muslims in a place that she can't divulge. The New York communities of several churches support Sarah Frazier's South Bronx-based house in Beekman, which serves children living under the poverty line. Ben leads a team that rescues modern-day slaves and victims of human trafficking in Manchester, England, and the list goes on and on of the kind of radical goodness that Peter is calling us to. Well, according to my timer, I have gone over 16, 17, 18, 19 seconds. So I'm going to do what we are often called upon to do. Would someone lead a brief prayer as we end? It's going to be brief, I promise you. You ready? Here we go. Let's pray. Father, thank you for bringing us together. Help us to move out of this place in radical goodness. We pray in Jesus' name.